Hey, Jefferson Calico here. In this video, we're going to take a short look at Sacramental Christianity. Now, because many of our students are perhaps more familiar with Protestant forms of Christianity, so the goal here is to, as we talk about Sacramental Christianity, is to better understand the Catholic Church and the Catholic practice of Christianity. We're going to start with two different ways of understanding the divisions in the Christian world. So we're going to first look at divisions or groups based on historical and institutional development. And then we're going to take a look at ways of looking at Christianity that have more to do with theology and practice. So let's look at those real quickly. This first diagram represents the historical development of the Christian tradition into three main institutional branches: the Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, and the Protestant churches. The Orthodox and the Roman Catholic branches of Christianity separated formally in the 11th century. And the Orthodox Church is that church, that branch of Christianity in the East, the eastern half of the old Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. So these are the churches in Eastern Europe, Russia, the Middle East, and Asia. And they are often, in the modern period, they have separated into various national churches. So you have the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Serbian Orthodox Church, and so on. The Roman Catholic Church became the primary form of Christianity in Western Europe, and unlike the Orthodox Church, which used the Greek language, the Roman Catholic, the Western Church, developed its ecclesiastical tradition, religious tradition, in Latin. So these are all the churches now. The Roman Catholic tradition is probably the largest branch of Christianity. And these are all the churches that look towards Rome, the Vatican, and the Pope as the authentic tradition and the authentic source of authority in the Christian tradition. So the Protestant branch of Christianity is composed of churches that emerged, and now this is a really rough history, but churches that emerged as a result of various protest movements against the Roman Catholic Church in the West, in Western Europe. The most well-known of which is the Protestant Reformation, led by Martin Luther in the early 1500s, the 16th century. And the only thing that really unites these churches in any way is that they don't identify as Catholic and don't look towards Rome or any of the other traditional centers of Christianity as sources of authority. Now, that was looking at the Christian tradition and its development through a historical and institutional lens. Now, there's a whole nother way of looking at the Christian tradition, and that is through theology and practice. And when we do that, we see a whole different structure and forms emerging, and that's what we want to look at now. So one type of theology and practice that we see in the Christian tradition is what I'm calling cognitive behavioral. And these are churches or movements that seek to experience God by teaching and knowing the Bible and living according to its moral code. And so these are going to be churches that this is their focus, and so mainline and evangelical Protestant churches would really fall into this area. And another approach to Christian theology and practice is the charismatic branch, and these are churches that seek to experience God, especially through the activity of the Holy Spirit. So through the indwelling of the Spirit and the use of the charismatic gifts that come from the Spirit. So these are Pentecostal, holiness, and apostolic, those sorts of churches. Now, a third theological and practical orientation within Christianity is the mystical tradition. Now, this really won't be necessarily a church or a set of churches, but this is small groups and movements that seek to experience God through practices of meditative and contemplative prayer. It's a fairly small, at this point in the contemporary period, it's a fairly small segment of Christian theology and practice. So this brings us then to Sacramental Christianity, which represents probably the oldest branches of the church, mainly Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches. And while these churches will do many of the other things, knowing and teaching the Bible, for instance, there's a primary focus around utilizing the sacraments as a means to know and experience God. All right, well, let's begin to take a look at sacraments and what sacraments are. Now, your book mentions the idea of sacraments in a couple places, and in my copy, one of those places is on page 16, where it's talking about your book is talking about the sacramental orientation in religion more generally. And it says, the sacramental orientation emphasizes carrying out rituals and ceremonies regularly and correctly as the path to salvation. Now, there are some good aspects to that definition. The sacramental orientation definitely concerns rituals and ceremonies. But I think if our Catholic friends were to read that definition, they would find that while it makes some degree of sense, it also falls short of a rich Catholic understanding of Christianity and faith and how it works. So we need to explore a little bit more. The book gives more of a definition of sacrament, and it says sacraments are the most important rituals in Christianity and are thought of as active signs of God's grace. These are sacraments. And that is it's a pretty good definition, active signs of God's grace. Let me give you a couple other definitions from some other sources. Another book on world religion calls a sacrament an outward visible sign of inward spiritual grace. Okay? And the definition perhaps that I like best, and it's very specific to Christianity, is that a sacrament or sacraments are sacred rites capable of transmitting the mystery of Christ to worshipers. Now, with that definition, we're getting very close to what a sacrament is and how it's understood to function. And to illustrate that a little more, I'm going to talk about water fountains. So, just consider this scenario. You are sitting there in class on campus, and you begin to get thirsty. Now, what are you going to do? Well, I know that what you would probably do is go buy a pop at the vending machine, but just go along with this thought experiment with me for a minute. So, one thing you could do is just sit there and be thirsty, but that's not very satisfying. Another thing you could do is you could go try to find some source of water, right? So you could go outside and try to drink out of a puddle, perhaps, or you could go to the fountain there on campus and drink out of the fountain. But that's not, you probably wouldn't do that. That's not very satisfying. I mean, those are not trustworthy sources of water. They could probably make you sick or whatever. You probably wouldn't do that. What you would probably do is go out into the hallway and find a water fountain and drink out of the water fountain. And that would make a lot of sense because you have good reason to believe, I mean, you know there's water at the water fountain, and you have good reason to believe that that water that you'll get from the water fountain is trustworthy. I mean, it's clean, pure, refreshing, nourishing water. And why is that? Well, because we know that the water fountain is attached through pipes to the water plant, or whatever, the source of good, clean, pure water at the water plant. It flows through these channels, these pipes, all the way from the pure source to that very water fountain. So when you go to that water fountain and drink from it, you're getting the pure, clean, refreshing water right from the source. And if you know that, if you believe that, then the proper thing to do, the thing that really makes sense to do, is to go to the water fountain and drink. That's where we find the pure, clean, refreshing water that will quench our thirst. Now, a sacrament functions in a very similar way to that water fountain scenario that we just talked about. So a sacrament is actually a channel through which God's grace flows into the physical world. Just like the water fountain is a specific place where you can get pure, clean water, so the sacrament is a place, a specific place in the physical world where this supernatural grace is available, where it flows into the physical world, and where it is reliably available. So using our water fountain analogy, then we see an important thing about the sacrament, and that is that in sacramental theology, it's not a sacrament that saves you, so to speak, but the sacrament is the place through which the grace of God is administered or available. So God chooses to administer or dispense or make available His grace into the human world through these sacraments, through specific ways, shapes, and forms. So those sacraments then, those places where grace is available might be people, for instance. So, for instance, priests who are chosen to administer God's grace and to distribute it to the people. So priests don't bless or forgive or absolve by their own power or righteousness, but they administer. They are channels through which Christ's grace can come. So the biblical example of how this functions is, let's take Mark chapter 8 and the feeding of the 4,000. So in this story, Jesus and His disciples are out in a remote place, and there's a large crowd that gathers around them, and it's time to eat, and everyone's hungry, but there's no food. So Jesus takes a few fish and bread, and He gives thanks, and He breaks them, and He performs this miracle of multiplication, and then He hands the bread and the fish to the disciples, and the disciples then go throughout the crowd and distribute the bread and the fish. That's all they do, but everyone is then fed and nourished. So the source, all the disciples do is distribute the priests, in a sense. So all they do is distribute the bread and the fish that Jesus gave them. Jesus is the source of the nourishment, or in our example, the grace, right? So he's the source of the nourishment, but He chooses to distribute it through these particular channels, who happen to be people, in this sense, His disciples. So another example of a channel through which God's grace is administered or dispensed, a sacrament, might be a ritual, like the book says. So the ritual of Eucharist or communion being the most common in Christianity. So in the sacramental tradition, this isn't just a reminder, it's not just a memorial, it's not just a reminder of Christ's death, but it's nor is it just a symbol of a spiritual reality, like an outward symbol of inward grace. It's not just a symbol, but through the Eucharist, through the communion, through the bread and the wine that is distributed, in some sense, the participant is actually receiving grace, receiving spiritual help, grace, power, forgiveness, receiving somehow the presence and the mystery of Christ, like one of our definitions said. So that bread and the wine is described as being the body and the blood of Christ. Of course, it's just bread and wine on one hand, yet in the spiritual understanding, as a sacrament, the presence of Christ is coming from the supernatural world into the physical world and being made apparent and real there in the Eucharist, in the communion. And so to take the communion then is to really be in touch with God in a real way. So another example of a sacrament or a channel through which God's grace flows into the physical world may be in the Orthodox tradition, so an object. In the Orthodox tradition, an icon, a painting. It's a type of sacred painting tradition in the Orthodox tradition, which are described as, these paintings are described as icons, as windows to the eternal. They have, in some sense, great spiritual power. It's not the window, it's not the picture itself that's being venerated or worshipped. It's the reality that's available through the icon, this spiritual reality that is communicated and comes into the physical world through the icon and its use, its ritual use. So believers connect with that grace, that power, that divine power, by kissing the icon, reverently praying before it, contemplating it in meditation. Again, it's not the physical object that is the object of worship or veneration, but it is seen as this sacramental object through which a supernatural reality can be connected with. So once we have an understanding of what a sacrament is and how it works, then just the final step is to see that in the sacramental tradition, faith makes use of the sacraments. So there's not this strict division between faith on one hand and works on the other. Here, as if works were another channel by which people make use of, to make themselves worthy of grace or worthy of salvation in some way. That's not how the sacramental tradition understands these sacraments, these physical objects and actions that you do as part of the sacramental tradition, rather. And it's actually the people of faith who know, who believe, just like if you believe that it's pure water coming through the water fountain, you're going to go and drink at the water fountain. So, in the same way, people of faith who believe in God, who have faith in God, then go to these sacraments as the truly reliable places through which the power and the grace of God comes. Now, there may be other places to drink, right? But those places may not be trustworthy. They may make you sick. They may even kill you. So with faith, there may be other ways to nourish your soul or nourish your spirit, but those other places aren't trustworthy. They could make you sick. They could kill you even. And so the person of faith goes to the reliable source where that pure water, that pure, the power and grace from the divine source flows. And the water fountains, right? The sacraments. So that's just a little bit about what a sacrament is and how it functions in the Christian tradition, the sacramental tradition. And I hope that helps to understand the approach that's used in these traditions and makes a little more sense.